morning, everybody. My name's Miranda Weinberg. I am this year's coordinator for the Nessa Wolfson Colloquium. I'm thrilled to see everybody here and thrilled to welcome Dr. Lourdes Ortega. But to kick things off, we're going to have some introductions, beginning with our dean, Pam Grossman. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you for organizing this. I'm delighted to welcome you all to Penn and Penn GSE and to the Nessa Wolfson Colloquium. And welcome to all of our new students as well who are here. We're delighted to have you. As many of you know, Nessa Wolfson was the founder of the, I want to make sure I get the title right, the Language and Literacy and Education Group at GSE. And was a professor at GSE from 1974 until 1990. She was also the first tenured woman professor at GSE, which is very notable, and luckily she was not the only one, and laid the foundation for the program in language and literacy and in educational linguistics at Penn GSE. It's grown into an internationally recognized program, and I think this colloquium is a wonderful tribute to the work that she did in initiating this at Penn GSE. I'm delighted to be here to hear Dr. Ortega's talk because it's true, we're living in challenging times. And what gives me hope in the challenging times we're living through right now is the work of all of our faculty and staff and students, and the work that you do every day to support our core values around diversity and inclusion. So I'm delighted to hear the talk today and looking forward to that. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Betsy Ryan, the chair of the Division of Education.
I think also the Nessa Wolfson Forum wins the award for most introductions. So thank you so much, Pam, for your introduction and for sort of welcoming everybody. It's really an honor to have you here at the Nessa Wolfson Colloquium. I guess I wanted to just say a couple things about the Nessa Wolfson Colloquium in particular and what it's about, why we even have it. So one of the reason it started is because it's to honor Nessa Wolfson's memory. She's not only the first tenured woman in GSE, she's also an intellectual powerhouse. And she died young, younger than I am right now, so it's sort of sobering. But her memory lives on. She did a lot of scholarly work. She's influenced a lot of sociolinguists and educational linguists and still continues to do so today. I was just talking to a professor who teaches the huge undergrad section of sociolinguistics here in the linguistics department, and she's using an article by Nessa Wolfson in her class this semester. Maybe some of those students are in the room, I don't know. So this is a time to sort of pause and remember a woman who was very important to the field and to continue to honor her memory. The second huge function that this colloquium serves is to welcome everybody to the semester. And I think it's a way of welcoming people by doing something that's closely related to all of the scholarly, intellectual, and practical work you do. So what better way to have an amazing speaker, coffee, delicious food. So this is our way to say, this is what EdLinguistics is about. Now, I do have one practical point to make, which is you may notice there are no tables for lunch set up. That's coming later. So after should end around 11:45. We're going to ask that everybody go outside and enjoy the lovely weather for about 15 minutes. It's kind of like a doctoral defense or something where everybody has to leave the room in a really awkward way. So go outside for 15 minutes while magic happens in here and tables get set up, and then come back at noon. You're all invited to lunch. And if you wait just a few minutes, tables will also be here. So So that's that practical message. So without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Yuko Butler, who's going to introduce Lourdes in more detail. Okay.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Lourdes Ortega. She's a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. As you know very well, she's a leading scholar in second language acquisition. I'm pretty sure everybody sitting here are so thrilled to have her today, and especially graduate students. I imagine that you must be so excited to see her in person after reading so many articles written by her. I imagine, I remember when I was in grad school and I was very excited to see a famous persons, after reading their articles. So Lourdes was originally from Spain, and she started her professional career as a Spanish language teacher. She has published numerous articles in journals, books, book chapters, and other publication forms. She has received a number of prestigious awards. I'm not going to go into her achievement today because it will take forever. But I just want to mention to you that she's always ahead of her time. When technology was introduced, people started introducing technology in language classrooms. She has paid close attention to the role of technology and future of technology in the context of task-based language teaching. That itself was relatively new at that time. And she made meta-analysis very popular in our field. And as you know that she is one of the leading figures for strongly advocating taking bilingual and multilingual approaches to second language acquisition, which, as you know, has predominantly taken monolingual approach. So on a personal note, I met Ortega, Dr. Ortega, for the first time at one of the Spencer's postdoc fellowship meetings. So at Spencer, for new recipients of the fellowship, was paired with the previous year's recipients. And Lourdes was my mentor. I am so fortunate to have her as my mentor, especially at my earlier stage in my career. And her work has been inspiring me so many different ways. I'm always excited to find out what kinds of stimulating question that she's going to cast to our field. So the title of our talk today is Second Language Acquisition in Uncertain Times, Disciplinary Constraints and Transdisciplinary Hopes. I'm pretty sure those who read her abstract cannot wait to see what she's going to say today. I certainly cannot wait. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Dr. Lourdes Ortega.
Thank you, Yuko. Thank you very much for the triple introductions, quadruple introductions. I'm so happy to be here and so honored and a little bit intimidated, but also feeling a lot like I'm at home, because I know so many of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. I have read so much of their work, and I know a lot of graduates from the program, and I know that you present students will take off with your careers and your contributions the way other students in the previous generations have. So you're very lucky to be here and to be studying under the scholars that you have on your faculty. And before saying anything else, let me check. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, good. I wanted to mention the people who have been organizing this visit. Miranda Weinberg and Betsy was the one who sent me the invitation initially, and I got so excited that I very unwisely said yes. I'm leaving on Wednesday next week for Belgium for another talk, so it really is crazy to try to fit in this talk, but I just couldn't not come. I was so excited with the invitation. And Nancy, of course, I think I was here on this campus probably 17 years ago, presenting, and I was reflecting on the fact that at that time it was the time of transparencies and handouts. I've improved a lot now, you will see. And then Catherine and Jennifer, who are the ones behind the working papers. And so this presentation will appear as a paper, as an article in the working papers at Penn. And Suzanne, who very diligently this morning had more paperwork for me. She's had to work really hard. I have a lot of people who I invite also to my campus, and I know that visitors are wonderful, but they create so much work, extra work, right? So I'm very grateful, and I'm very much looking forward to spending the rest of the day here with you. And also, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with anyone who wants it, so no need to take notes or get stressed by following or not following. If you're interested in the references, I can share the PowerPoint too. All right, let me see. It's 10:10. I should speak until 11 maximum. Is that right? Good. All right, so let me start by saying why I immediately thought about giving a talk that would explore SLA, second language acquisition, because that's my field, but also would have to explore this idea that we live in very uncertain times. Compare the goals of UNESCO for 2030. They're trying to galvanize governments and nations to end poverty, promote peace, share wealth, and protect the planet by 2030. And they're working very hard at it, the UNESCO is. But at the same time, compared to what's happening in the world right now, we have non-solidarity, anti-diversity, authoritarianism, and a widening poverty gap. So things are not really going well in the world, despite all best intentions by many different kinds of people and institutions. We're all worried constantly about news. The news are very, very upsetting in the United States, but so is news also in many other parts of the world. And we are getting to be more active in our contributions to trying to stand by our values and to try to oppose and resist oppression. This was right after inauguration, the next day in the march over Washington, and I thought I had a little bit of interest in technology. At that time, he hadn't started tweeting that much, right? But he had already started. So this woman, that was her message during the march. So amidst these uncertain times, multilingualism is as old as humanity, but has always been contested. So we have two biblical references or metaphors. The Tower of Babel, where humankind is seen as punished by the confusion of languages. So multilingualism is a curse. And Pentecost, where the 12 apostles suddenly can speak in any language with whoever they meet so that they can spread the word of God. So the plurality of languages is seen as a gift to humankind there. And Roland Barthes commented already in 1977 that political power has always strived to force us to abandon the Pentecostal swarm of plural tongues for a single language so that we can be united, unified, as before Babel. Most of the world is multilingual and has always been because we are born to a family and we have the language or languages of the home. Then usually we go into schooling and there we confront the languages of schooling, which tend to be the languages of the nation state. Then if none of those two contexts give us English, we get English through globalization. And for many people, life brings many other languages along. But the world is also unequitable multilingual. So Joe LoBianco has a really nice way of putting it, very simple, very concise. One of the main sources of inequity when it comes to multilingualism happens in the transition between home and school. So is the language or languages of the home the same as the language or languages of schooling? If there is a continuity between the two, and if there is sufficient family and community wealth to access education, technology, English, and all these symbolic goods that we all want, then we end up being elite multilinguals. But if there is a discontinuity between the languages in the home and the languages of schooling, and usually that means the nation state, and if there is especially uncertain family and community wealth to access all those important things we all want, then we may end up being marginalized multilinguals. Bilingualism and multilingualism are fuzzy and probabilistic. Multilingualism comes in many shapes and grades. And the multilingual's language competencies and practices are irreducible to dichotomies, because it's a trait of multilingualism and multilingual lives that we go constantly through learning, unlearning, relearning, and even non-learning of language over a lifetime of experiences. An example from a celebrity or a famous artist, Marc Chagall. He grew up speaking Yiddish and reading Hebrew. He hated Russian, but that became his dominant language. He learned French by immersion only in the span of 2 or 3 years, and spoke it fluently with a Russian Yiddish accent. He went to the exile in New York during World War II, but never learned English, even though he was surrounded by it. And then he lived his last 30 years in France. That's a very famous case of a multilingual. Lots of non-elective multilingualism in this life. Here's another case. A 9-year-old heritage Portuguese speaker in Germany, when asked to draw herself speaking the languages they know, this kid drew the family, and everyone, you notice, has bubbles and different languages coming out of them and uniting them. So a very holistic sense of what multilingualism means in this kid's family. And yet another case in a very nice study by Huamei Han, investigating Africa Town in Guangzhou, China. One of the participants is Laura, a grassroots multilingual immigrant who in her mid-30s moved from Sichuan to Guangzhou. So that's about 800 miles or 1,200 kilometers. That's a little bit like the distance between Philadelphia and Chicago. But it's a very, very important move within the confines of China. And so that gave her a multilingualism that included Sichuan dialect, Mandarin, Cantonese, and English. But look at how she picked up English, how she willfully learned English. I taught myself English. I learned a little in school, but forgot all of it. How are you? I wrote down in Chinese, how are you? And this was how I learned. When I started my first shop, she was the owner of a small shop. I sublet half of it to 2 good-looking young women who could speak English. First, to share the rent, and second, I could ask them for help with English. But when I had customers, they refused to help. You should hire a translator, they said. So I was very upset and started to learn secretly. Whatever they said, I wrote down and memorized. Gradually, I learned. I can understand and speak, but I cannot write. I actually have taught a few other young women English, because many of them are from the countryside, like she was, and never went to school, so they could not read and write. So this is a grassroots multilingual, very little schooling, very little formal study of English, and yet a ferocious determination to function in English and to learn English and to spread English. So researching multilingualism in order to support it is the business, responsibility, and mission of educational linguists and of second language acquisition researchers. Clearly, part of our research is to produce knowledge about all shapes and grades of multilingualism and to serve all multilinguals, not just those with privilege. So the question that I want to explore is how willing and able is SLA to respond to the present challenges? So the rest of the plan is to go through 4 constraints that I think hamper SLA's capacity to generate useful and actable upon knowledge about multilingualism. Then I have come up with 10 willful strategies that I think would help to turn hopes into reality. And my entire vision for my field of SLA is, can we have a new SLA, please? One that responds to the challenges of the 21st century and one that really is designed to support equitable multilingualism. So, the first disciplinary identity, the first constraint is the disciplinary identity of SLA because it's built around the language too and around the notion of late timing. So, we think that SLA studies the acquisition of an additional, a new language that is learned later in life, usually after schooling has begun, prototypically during adulthood. But the problem is that these things are framed also quite negatively. So when the focus is only on the L2 and the studies don't include the other languages of the multilinguals, we end up with a monolingual research habitus. The sampling, the data elicitation, the data analysis, the constructs, the interpretations, all of them are completely enmeshed into monolingual interpretations. In the end, we're trying to explain learning how to behave monolingually in the new language. And the negative framings of late timing are not usually picked up, but they are staggering. So adults' neural and physiological maturity is talked about in published research as irreparable atrophy of the human capability for new language learning. An irreparable atrophy, just because the brain is already mature, right? Or the linguistic maturity that any adult has, because we already function in other languages when we're learning a new one, is seen as a roadblock to learning the second language. The cognitive maturity that we all adults have, the capacity to self-regulate, it's construed in the published research as an over-reliance on explicit cognition, which is said to be inefficient for the task of language learning. And social maturity, again, we construe it as the culprit for affective, motivational, and attitudinal forces that negatively impact on adults' willingness or ability to learn from the input and from others. Even the outcomes, of course, are always framed negatively, so it's really about asking ourselves as researchers of second language development, how is L2 acquisition different from and more difficult and unsuccessful than monolingual child acquisition? That's really the question that has driven the field until now. There have been, of course, people from within SLA championing against this. Vivian Cook, for example, as an antidote to only the L2, he proposed multi-competence, a focus on the whole system of the multilinguals. Jim Lantos, as an antidote to viewing late timing as always negative, proposed a focus on higher order cognition. Learning is something that people make happen. It doesn't happen to people. People make it happen through intentional social interaction and co-construction of reflected upon knowledge. But by and large, those two cornerstones, the focus on the L2 only and the negative focus on late timing, remain untouched. When we study only one of the languages of the bilinguals, we end up incomprehensibly separating the same person into two different kinds of studies. So we have the heritage studies looking at the Spanish of these multilinguals, and the 1.5 generation studies looking at the English of these multilinguals. And it's the same people. The participants are the same in both types of studies, but the two sets of knowledge do not speak to each other or interact. And the tyranny of time is terrible. So we compare early to late development, and we compare monolingual to bilingual development, right? When we compare children learning one language only to adults learning a new language on top of the ones that they have. So what we're doing is comparing on two parameters, the timing and the number of languages, without any constant. You can't compare if you don't keep something constant. So you are comparing apples and oranges, because for the children learning one language only, we're looking at single language competencies during early childhood. But for adults adding yet one more language to their repertoire, we're looking at multiple language competencies later in life. So what we create in the field is a mirage of L2 acquisition as monolingual-like and impossible. The essentialist ontology of language is the second constraint and problem. When we think of language as being essential, we're thinking of language as a noun. It's a system, right? We all have said this many times. But in a non-essentialist view of language, we would use gerund thinking about language. It's a process. If it's a noun, a system, it carries meaning. Language carries meaning. But if it is a gerund, if it's a process, then it constructs meaning. If it's an essentialist ontology, we think of knowledge in the mind. Language is knowledge in the mind. But if it's a non-essentialist ontology, we think of socially distributed accomplishment on the fly. So particularly until the 90s, SLA definitely had an essentialist language ontology at the center of their understanding of language. Language was an objective reality, is separable from communication, and it resides in the mind. That's very explicitly Chomskyan. It's a system made of such systems, sounds, words, sentences, and it can be captured in grammar books, dictionaries, and corpora. That's very Saussurean or Bloomfieldian. And the disciplinary goal is to understand language development, and we all know what language development is, right? Knowledge plus ability to use it. But that's not the only choice. There are contemporary non-essentialist language ontologies that we could turn to, where language is viewed as constructing meaning iteratively out of recurrent social activities, yet often incomplete, unpredictable, and on the fly. Language is viewed as a reality only as a process of communicating. And language is located in social activity, which is distributed among social actors. So here we have a view of language that is very heterogenizing and diversifying, that is viewed as semiotic repertoires, and where no one owns language because it's not an object to be owned or had. That's clearly incompatible with the view of SLA. Some people have championed against it, and so we have the usage-based family of theories in second language acquisition, and they posit that grammar is not an out-there system and that it's inseparable from the users and the usage events. So we have many key scholars working under this type of theory or inspiration of ideas, and also conversation analysis for SLA is producing work that really reflects a non-ontologist, a non-essentialist ontology of language. But the problem really persists, and we just cannot longer afford privileging standard educated, academic, literate, idealized, homogenized varieties of the elites as the target that learners and multilinguals aspire to learn. We cannot hold any longer narrow views of what it means to know a language or to have communicative competence. And as researchers, as a field, we should not be recreating and propagating ideologies of standard language and purist ideologies. We also instill linguistic insecurity with these ontological positions that are essentialist. So many bilinguals have a tendency to evaluate their language competencies as inadequate. Some criticize their mastery of language skills, others strive their hardest to reach monolingual norms, others still hide their knowledge of their weaker language, and most simply do not perceive themselves as being bilingual, even though they use 2 or more languages regularly. And if I asked you in the audience, how many of you consider yourselves bilingual or multilingual, raise your hand. How many other people didn't? I'm sure you have other languages. I'm sure you have different degrees, grades, and shades of multilingualism in you, but you are suffering from linguistic insecurity, which the research helps create, propagate, and confirm. So it's a huge problem for the research, especially, and for the multilinguals. Also, we can very soon, with an ontology that is essentialist, we can very soon render many, many multilinguals in the world excludable from study. And the example is heartbreaking. It's Peel and Lambert, a very famous study for initiating the revalorization of bilingualism. They had a pool of over 350 10-year-old children in Montreal, and they had a group that they classified as monolinguals because they only knew French, a group that they classified as bilinguals because they got similar scores in French and in English on a very thorough battery of scores that they administered, and then they had 200 students in the sample, and they decided to exclude them from the study. Why? Because they weren't equally skilled in French and English, because they could not unambiguously be classified as either monolingual or bilingual. So this is over 50% exclusion from the study. So what are we studying then, if we don't want to study over half of the multilinguals in the world because they're fuzzy in their competence, because we don't know which language to assign to them as proficient? What phenomena then are we studying as a field? We're studying only elite bilingualism, basically, and this should not be enough to capture what the human language and the capacity for multilingualism is like. Remember Laura, the grassroots multilingual? We have absolutely no information in SLA about her language development, her language competencies, or her communicative repertoires. People like her are just never, ever, ever studied from an SLA viewpoint. The teleological view of development is also the third constraint. It's a vexing problem. Linguistic development is understood in SLA as a ladder to heaven or to some kind of a very, very unfortunate monolingual-like competence, right? Like the native speaker. So this is the problem. If we consider that early is best, and if we consider that having just one language, a single language, is natural, very soon we end up with the superiority of monolingual nativeness. So the late timing and the L2 only values create eventually a huge problem of linguicism in the way we study bilinguals and multilinguals. We have had some voices disputing this and trying to move things forward, and one of them is Diane Larsen-Freeman. Since 1997, she's been saying that there is no end and there is no state in language development. And we just put out a book in her honor that is in press, and in her 30 aphorisms that capture a complexity view of language development, 2 are very important. Learning is not climbing a developmental ladder, and it's not unidirectional, it is non-linear. And language and its learning have no endpoints. Both are unbounded. Yet, the majority of the field goes on with this idea of teleology. Native speakers are still the unquestioned golden benchmark in SLA research, and birth privileges are still pervading metaphors in the field such as incomplete acquisition, processing versus representational deficits. This is what some researchers debate, the kinds of deficits that we have in bilinguals and multilinguals. L1 entrenchment, so L1 as a problem, and competition between languages. So multilingualism is almost impossible because the languages are always competing for space in the life and in the brain of multilinguals. I'm going to skip these and say what's the fourth, and for me the most important problem. Values are viewed as non-scientific in SLA. Excuse me. We have three positivistic assumptions that drive the field. One is that there is a fact-value dichotomy. Facts are about theory and knowledge building. They are the goal of research. Values are about practical applications, a posteriori kinds of things that we worry about later, and independent from theory building. So this is the distinction between basic and applied research, which is typical of Weberian technicism. Facts, the second assumption is that facts are neutral, that knowledge can and must be neutral and objective. So this is typical of post-positivism and positivism. And the third assumption is that values are irrational. Values are a matter of personal choice. They escape rational scrutiny. And this is called emotivism by a philosopher of ideas, McIntyre. Instead of technicism, positivism, and emotivism, we could have these. Acknowledge that research must be accountable to both facts and values, that all knowledge is value-laden, and that values can be critiqued and defended publicly. There is some engagement now, beginning with ethics in the field of SLA. We're talking more about IRB types of ethics, the relevance of SLA research for teachers, the need to study vulnerable populations, and very, very, very little recognition, but some, that research is value-laden. But I think that values can and should guide quantitative linguistic cognitive research, because that's what SLA in the end is about, quantitative linguistic and cognitive research. That is not opposed to talking, acknowledging, and grappling with values. So I've been writing a bit about it, and that I think is the part that my colleagues reject the most when I present about these topics to them. They just cannot, anything else they can engage to some extent with, but engagement with the idea that values are important and should drive the research and should be in the research, that they are in the research, therefore they should be discussed and justified, is something that is really difficult to get them to engage with. I'm going to skip this, even though it's beautiful. A study. It's a study that we've done, Casey Keck and myself, and we're finishing it now. It's a corpus linguistics and critical discourse analysis study. Basically, what we're finding is that in the published research, more often than not, learners are characterized as passive recipients, affected entities, but not agents. They're characterized as successful. When they are said to be successful, it's always only partially, in ways that need to be carefully qualified. Although, when, sometimes, not always, and when they are talked about as deficient, it's always in a general sense, without any need for any qualification. So those are the three findings that we are uncovering in our analysis of about more than 9 million words of published articles in applied linguistics, not just SLA. Okay, so these are the constraints. I want to go for hopes. I'm a very optimistic person, but I want to be realistic too. So there are reasons for hope. No ideologies are hermetic or homogeneous, and I've been mentioning voices all along from within SLA questioning these practices and these ideologies. And SLA has become epistemologically very diverse and much more attuned towards cognitive social interfaces and transdisciplinarity. So really, we don't have one kind of cognitive SLA theory, and we do not have one kind of sociocultural theory of SLA. We have many right now. And we've been doing some publications where some cognitively oriented SLA researchers interact with socially oriented SLA researchers. And Jan Hulstein, Richard Young, and myself, we were coordinating them, editing them into a collective article. And so that was interesting. And now we have also the Douglas Fir article where 15 colleagues, all of them socially minded, we joined and tried to put together our thoughts for what do we share that is different from just a traditional cognitive orientation in SLA. But there are reasons to worry, because if there is so much epistemological change from within SLA and so much growing for expanding capacities, why does SLA still go about as business as usual, right? And in my mind, the research habitus is just not changing and not changing fast enough. And on the other hand, the world is becoming more and more uncertain. So again, how willing and able is SLA to contribute to the goal of equitable multilingualism? Okay, so here are my 10 willful strategies. They start from things that I think my SLA colleagues would be more willing to try to envision and to try out in their studies. And little by little, they get a lot more into the values issue. And I don't know how many of my SLA colleagues would be willing to give it a try. But I'm hopeful that with enough presentations, not just to preach into the choir like here, but with enough presentations also to insiders in the field, eventually we're going to get somewhere. So one thing we could do is, as much as possible, collect evidence from multilinguals across all their languages. So the same people, all their languages in one study. I have a call that I brought from Spain and my mom, and it's been 3 weeks now, and it doesn't leave me. So why is it good to collect data from the same people across their languages in the same SLA studies? Well, here's an example. Brown and Goldberg, they were looking at manner expression in motion events, so how often someone will say they walked into the room as opposed to they went into the room, right? So encoding the manner of doing things, which is a very English-like way to do it, but it's not very Japanese-like or Spanish-like or Korean-like. Many other languages don't like encoding the manner in the verb. So when bilingual second language users of English were looked at and compared to monolinguals doing it in English, the findings, and it's always the same, the English of native and non-native speakers is different. Okay? But if you compare those bilinguals using their first language to monolinguals of that first language, Japanese in this case, suddenly you see that the L1 of monolinguals and bilinguals is different. So they were also statistically significantly different, right? And then if you compare the same people doing the same thing in their two languages, then suddenly it's like, whoa, these bilinguals are similar in their Japanese first language and in their English second language, right? So basically what we're seeing is that if you compare bilinguals doing L2 to monolinguals of that L2, you see that bilinguals are not monolinguals. If you compare bilinguals doing their L1 to monolinguals of that L1, you see that bilinguals are not monolinguals. And when you compare bilinguals doing the same thing in their languages, then you see that bilinguals are whole. First language, second, third, whatever. They're whole people with whole language, right? So these kinds of data can be very powerful as an argument for people who like quantitative cognitive linguistic research in SLA. More of these findings can really move the field forward. Bilinguals are not monolinguals. Second thing, we could reframe late timing positively. So the later is better argument, traditionally it was said that, it was recognized very early in the field of SLA that later is better only initially though. So because in the long run, children catch up with adults. In the beginning, adults and adolescents can go faster. But within 1 to 3 years, the children who started as children become better and surpass the adults. That was the traditional finding. But guess what? If you look at the bilingualism literature closely, you find out that a later start accelerates early timed acquisition as well. So we have studies of bilingual children. If they start later rather than earlier with another language, they have a boost. They have an initial rate advantage. If you look at international adoptees, very interesting. If they're adopted later, they start learning the new language very fast compared to other children who are adopted earlier. And with American Sign Language, some of them, unfortunately, start with their first only language quite late in life. So they don't have any language until age 4, 6, and in this study, 14. And yet, when they start learning ASL, they are, in the beginning, very much faster and make much faster progress. So what we can see also is that now we know that the boost and the acceleration is durable in some contexts for adults. So in foreign language settings now we have a lot of evidence that that boost exists and it's durable. So after high school, after college, children who started EFL earlier in school are not better off eventually than children who started a little bit later. So what does this all mean? That a later start confers an accelerating boost, and that mature higher order cognition is something that is not just negative, it is also positive, right? So a later start poses not only challenges, but also benefits. And so let's think not only of maturational constraints, but also of maturational opportunities. We could also focus on experience. Less timing concern, more experience research, right? Because experience may trump age when the two variables are studied without conflating them. And so these studies, which are from cognitive science, they're not SLA studies, they have appeared in very powerful, well-respected journals. They are not read by SLA researchers, but they show that when age and experience are pitted against each other while controlling, instead of letting age and experience be confounded, then oftentimes experience trumps age, and age is much less important. We could also not take the language environment for granted, though, and study linguistic duress in late bilingualism. So one's experience of language, the environmental affordances, are important, and we view them as shaping linguistic success in bilingual development, then the linguistic environment and not the child or the adult learner may be wanting. What do we know about this black box of experience? Very little, because not many studies in SLA look at it, but we know that there is very limited access to the L2 in many contexts, even when those contexts are immersive. So in a study in Canada, for example, Chinese international graduate students ended up having, on average, 11 minutes of friendly conversation in English with friends or acquaintances. That's all the access they had to English. Or in the UK, another study, after 4 months of immersion and study in UK universities, international students were still reporting that they just couldn't interact in the L2. They couldn't find friends. They couldn't hang out with people and use English. And the same thing with study abroad. Oftentimes is uncovered that, yes, students are studying another language abroad. They're not able to access it necessarily. So I think it's a strategically good theoretical empirical move to claim reduced exposure conditions or reduced access conditions as probably definitional of late bilingual development, and to study this kind of linguistic duress. So let's check out the facts about experience. How much access really to language before we assume that there are inherent benefits or inherent deficits in learners. We could also, excuse me. So up to here, I think, okay, sorry. Up to here, I think my SLA colleagues would say, well, yeah, those are interesting leads. We can explore them empirically. But now the more doubtful territory starts. we could consider probabilistic variable language outcomes as a staple of all language development. So, how variable really is the success of L2 adult learners, and how specific of a later timing? I think not so. So I would like to see the field working towards variable outcomes as a staple of all bilingual and multilingual language development. Because even in native from birth bilingualism, linguistic success is not guaranteed or uniform or categorical. Again, if we look at the literature closely, we will see that. But everyone misses it. Either we're not looking at the literature or we're reading it with our biases and missing the point. Yeah? So bilingual success is absolutely indeed possible. But unbalanced bilingualism is a very expected and normal outcome of bilingualism. The shift to the L2 as the dominant or stronger language in minority bilingualism is expected and normal. And there are studies showing that 1 out of 4 children who are born to bilingual families and have access exposure to both languages from birth, 1 of 4 will end up functionally speaking one, not both languages. So nothing like categorical, uniform, homogeneous success, because birth gave it to us, right? So here's very controversial. I think we can probably say that if the timing is very, very early or from birth, probabilistically maybe 3 of 4 children are going to be successful to varying degrees, but largely successful. And 1 out of 4 children will fail. Very, very difficult to even defend that notion of failing. But let's agree that we can say that. In later timed bilingualism, then, we have the opposite pattern. And again, a lot of my colleagues wouldn't even agree with this because they will say all adults fail. Not even 1 of 4 succeeds. All of them fail. But what's happening, I think, is that bilingualism as a whole is characterized by probabilistic success, and the timing may be influencing in the reverse likelihood. Yeah? So much more likely with earlier timing, much less likely with later timing, but profoundly variable graded probabilistic outcomes, right? We could also view multilingual acquisition as the human default. Bilingualism as the Galapagos Island of language acquisition, I call it. Darwin didn't go to the Galapagos Island to study a very interesting, diverse environment, to understand the Galapagos Island. No, he wanted to create a theory of evolution. And for that, the key piece was that particular island and that particular diversity. So I think that's what's happening with us. Monolingual acquisition is not the richest type of data because exposure to one language only is maximal, and variability, which is, I think, a natural outcome of any language learning, is flattened out. We miss it because it's so minimal, because exposure is so maximal. But with bilingual acquisition or multilingual acquisition, then we have ideal data because exposure can vary maximally, yielding maximally relevant evidence for human language acquisition. So bilingual, multilingual data are a necessary fertile ground to crack acquisition because it yields the most relevant evidence about the role of experience of language in outcomes. But we have to not to try to make categorical something which is probabilistic and fuzzy. We have to study different kinds of multilinguals for who they are. And we have to hone our instruments, if we're going to do quantitative linguistic cognitive research, to understand relevant participant variables. Number 7. I need to go faster. Yeah? Okay. I'll go a little bit faster. It's never okay. Being long is never okay. We should always fight it, but. Okay, number 7 of 10 strategies. We could embrace language learning success as being about much more than language and study social duress. You all study that. This is not anything new to you. But I think in my field of SLA, people want to study language, right? So linguistic duress, which is a concept that I'm proposing to sort of like make people realize that probably access to language is very much more reduced for adults than it is for children, so the timing is doing that. It's reducing the richness and the access to language. But I think when that needs to be counterbalanced with the idea of social duress as well, right? So if we want to do cognitive research, that's fine. But guess what? Cognition is not cold. Cognitive science nowadays posits that cognition is hot. And language learning is also not cold. It's attentionally gated, socially gated, and emotionally gated. So what's second language learning about? It's about language, social context, identity and emotions, agency and self-regulation, but also about power and ideologies and social transformation. And so what are the consequences of that for learning? Well, identity, agency, ideology, and power, they all matter for language learning, for linguistic development, right? So this is an example from one of my students many years ago. She was an ESL teacher in training, and this was a journal I asked my students to keep. And she was explaining in the journal, once I had a student who kept saying, I came from Korea. I tried to correct her grammar by saying, if you are originally from Korea, you should use present tense when you refer to it. Where are you from? I come from Korea. And then she goes on in her journal, my student said, since I don't want to go back to Korea and identify myself with American, I'd rather say I came from Korea and wish to be an American one day. My teacher was horrified, like, what do I say now? What do I do now? How do I respond to this? Right? Okay, I'm gonna skip this. So I think we need to study social duress. So we need to ask in SLA studies, how do sociocultural and ideological forces in L2 users' social worlds interact with and modulate access to language? So social duress interacting with linguistic duress. But social duress is not fixed or deterministic, so transformation and opportunity out of social duress must be also studied. How do human imagination and agentivity transform odds at success by engendering resistance, leveraging of power, liminal contingent identity performances, changing investments, subversion of constraints? So we can't be totally pessimistic studying linguistic duress or social duress. We need to allow for all these ways in which we humans make things work against all odds. We could refuse to engage in subordinating comparisons and native speakerism as a field. This example is about the subjunctive. In US and UK English, apparently the subjunctive is much more used in the US, and modals like should, shall, and may are preferred in the UK. So what are we going to conclude from that? That UK English users underuse the subjunctive, or that they overuse modals? Absolutely not, right? We just say, oh, look how interesting. UK and US English are different in terms of the preferences for using subjunctive versus modals. So then how come can we say that when L1 monolingual Spanish and heritage bilingual Spanish users are compared, we notice that the L1 monolingual Spanish use subjunctive more, and the heritage Spanish use subjunctive less, right? And then we conclude things like the heritage Spanish grammars exhibit incompleteness. How can we justify this conclusion? I mean, like, what does it mean to conclude this, right? Equal value is at the heart of a non-subordinating comparison. So there is no defensible way of saying that US or UK English are superior to each other, right? So we make the reasonable inference that they're just different because we see them as equitable, right? But we don't do the same thing for monolingual first language Spanish grammars and heritage grammars. Obviously, we just don't see them naturally as equal or equitable. Right? If we need benchmarks, let's not choose monolinguality or nativeness. Let's choose mature, experienced users. If we have to focus on language development, let's not assert a teleology. Let's not impose theoretical ceilings to language development. Let's remember that there is no stage and there is no end. Number 9, this is what I've been finding for many years now, absolutely impossible to get a real engaged response. Address harmful SLA ideologies head on. So for me, a useful way to think about this is to use Jane Hill's analysis of language ideologies that support covert racism. So she identifies a personalist ideology where meaning is thought to come from speakers' intentions, a referentialist ideology when meaning is thought to come from reference, so the words should match the world and be true. Social alexithymia, which I love because it's a Greek word, and whenever I can, I do that too. I speak modern Greek, so it's a form of translanguaging that most people will miss, but I am doing it, so I'm not missing it. I know why I'm doing it. Social alexithymia is Jane Hill's words, though. Social alexithymia is the inattention to the feelings of people who are the target of systemic discrimination. And finally, performative ideology. It's when we think and recognize that some words are not understood as true or false, but as assaultive, for example, in the case of hate speech. So, SLA researchers, do we assume responsibility? We have two options. Option 1, we can embrace certain ideologies that support inaction. We could think, well, I am a good and normal mainstream sort of SLA researcher. I am not a deficit-oriented researcher because deficit-oriented people are bad and marginal people. That's the personalist part of the ideology. I'm not that kind of person, right? Therefore, if you understood my words to be linguicist, deficit-oriented, you must be mistaken. The referentialist ideology. I may have used language that would be considered racist, deficit, linguicist in the mouth of a different kind of person. But if I did so, I didn't mean it. Right? So it's the personalist, referentialist ideology. If you understood my meaning to be racist, deficit-oriented, linguicist, not only do you insult me, you are oversensitive. That's the social alexithymia. Or we can have another option. We can confront the ethical problem through a performative ideology that demands action. So the linguicism of the monolingual native virtue is traumatic for those who are targets of it. Whether accurate or inaccurate referentialist ideology, whether intentional or unintentional personalist ideology, it hurts. That's the performative ideology. And therefore, it cannot be dismissed as exaggerated. Instead, it must be redressed with reparation. I'm going to skip that. Yeah, many people ask me, that's just political correctness. It's not, I think. I really, truly think it's not. It's a realignment of discourse with beliefs, values, and desired effects. Finally, and this is the last one, right? Could we, SLA researchers, respond to our uncertain times? Can we as a field go perhaps far enough to be able to discuss and develop explicit social justice goals for the study of later timed multilingual learning? So if we think that some kinds of bilinguals, multilinguals, do suffer oppression and are marginalized in part because of the language learning and relearning and non-learning that goes on in their lives. How could we create knowledge through our studies that help us improve resilience towards conflictive bilingualism and experiences and ideologies that are conflictive and oppressive for these kinds of contexts for language learning? For our elite multilinguals too, they experience being the other, the foreigner, the incompetent, fleetingly on and off, but they do experience it. We all experience it when we learn a new language, right? We all reproduce social injustice as we learn a new language. But these privileged multilinguals, they might also be an asset in addressing social justice that is related to language learning, precisely because they have privilege, so they may be able to use it well. So how can we produce studies that give us knowledge to improve the tolerance of dissimilar others in multilinguals and language learners who are doing it out of elite types of reasons? And how can we do research that produces knowledge about how language learners who are elite, who are privileged, can learn to use their privilege to support social justice for other multilinguals and for themselves. And lately, I've been thinking about this too, which for a long time, I haven't wanted to think. What about monolinguals? I get asked this a lot, because normally I never mention the monolinguals. And my response has been in the past, let other people worry about monolinguals. They are already too important in my taste, in our research. I'm not going to worry about the monolinguals. I want to work for the sake of multilinguals and bilinguals. But now I'm thinking with all these recent things, lives and times that we're living, we could produce research even for our monolinguals. So we have in the United States 80% of English-speaking children in K through 12 education who will not enroll in world languages. And 75% of mainstream Americans will have never studied another language at any point in their lives. These are statistics that I've found actually published, right? So these so-called monolinguals, it's difficult to believe in pure monolingualism, but let's say that they are monolinguals functionally by and large. Could we study under what circumstances can the study of another language, exposure to another language, lead to more human empathy, democratic values, and critical global citizenship? We assume that it does. We always say, oh, the study of a world language makes you much more open to the world, much more tolerant of everything. We have no data for that. No data. Right? And what life experiences beyond multilingualism support empathy and democratic values and critical global citizenship in monolinguals? Because I have some monolinguals who are the closest to me in my personal life. And some of them, just like multilinguals and bilinguals, some of them are absolutely into purist, prescriptivist, oppressive ideologies of language, but others are the most amazingly tolerant and positive ideology people that I know. So not everyone who speaks only one language or functions only in one language is intolerant of diversity and empathic of others. So how can we study these things from the point of view of language and language learning? So, in conclusion, I think these four problems are really what are keeping the field back. So anything we can do to work at any of the four is good. I remain with hopes, high hopes. We've had a social turn in SLA. We are having sort of a multilingual turn. We may be able to have a social turn eventually. And I want to see that moving forward into making equitable multilingualism a goal of the field and fighting off these very uncertain times that we live. So for 50 plus years, the field of second language acquisition has pursued the question, how is second language acquisition different and more difficult than monolingual child acquisition? So I think it's about time that we start asking, how can SLA promote equitable multilingualism as a social value and as a window into understanding human language development as a whole? And that's the end.
So thank you to Dr. Ortega, and we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I will take this microphone to whoever is interested in starting us off.
Yes, thank you very much for an exciting talk. Let me start off with what came across to me as a fascinating argument about sort of monolingual multilingualism. My point of view at the moment is that there's a danger to disparage monolingualism or monolinguals as those bad people. We should all be moving towards multilingualism. I think we need, like you were saying, we need to be quite sensitive that there's quite a lot that we benefit from those monolingualism. And the issue is not monolingualism that is that we should encourage. The type of monolingualism we should encourage is what I may call humanistic monolingualism. You accept the humanity that you can account for in terms of the individual. And then I understand that we are trying to move from monolingualism to multilingualism, but the question is, is that okay? Because as long as conceptually we understand multilingualism as a multiplication of one, we haven't moved away from it. Because we fundamentally are saying multilingualism simply means now we put more of what we have at the same time. So multilingualism at this particular time in my thinking is a very interesting illusion to go for, because we conceptually haven't been able to get there. We're simply pluralizing what we think we've already got in terms of monolingualism. That's...
Yeah. That's a very, very, very important comment, and I absolutely agree with it, and I see it. So first, demonizing monolinguals, it's a huge problem, and that's why I'm thinking now, the last slide, like, what about monolinguals? Why can't I incorporate that into the framework that I'm trying to create? And that for me has been very recent, because I do get the comment from monolinguals, particularly in audiences, like, what about monolinguals? So definitely we need to have humanistic monolingualism. I love the term, so I'll be citing it from now on with proper acknowledgement. But yeah, I think that that's very valuable. Now the second part of the question comment is also very interesting. It's this idea that I still am not there where I want to be by calling it multilingualism, because I'm doing that by reference to monolingualism as the default. So language, we have one, and then if we have many, we multiply what we have, and that's when we start talking about multilingualism, right? I think is your argument and the argument of critical sociolinguistics that we just have language. And we don't count languages, and we don't cut them out into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For SLA, that is a very, very difficult non-essentialist view of language to accept. I have days when I accept it, and I have days when I don't. So I do engage with it, and I didn't mention translanguaging, for example, or translingual practices, because I don't want to get into all of that. It's yet another presentation, but I know, I'm very, very aware that that's really an area to explore. For my purposes, when I try to mobilize audiences of colleagues who also investigate SLA, like I do from more traditional points of view, getting there is as difficult as getting into the values are part of everything, and we need to engage with them. So probably within a year or 2 or 3 maybe.
Let me give you the last term. Multilingualism is not anaphoric monolingualism.
Right.
Combining what you have said.
Multilingualism is not
Anaphoric monolingualism.
anaphoric. Okay. Okay, so I'm taking those two. Humanistic monolingualism and multilingualism is not anaphoric of monolingualism. And I'll chew on those as well. But I completely understand what you're talking about, and I'm very sympathetic to it.
So thank you for a really inspirational talk. Just on a personal level, I come from a very multilingual family, and I've always very much struggled with how to find myself in SLA research, but also how to represent others. And I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways from this talk is thinking about how I particularly liked your slide where you looked at how, the heritage learner from one perspective, the deficient bilingual, whatever, and I've experienced that myself. I think for SLA as a field, being very conscious of context and the way in which context and power relations shape those naming practices, and putting at the forefront, what I really appreciated about this talk was being responsible for the choices you make when you name. And I think as someone who's also an educator, that is seen very clearly in schools and the way in which we talk about students and how that talk has consequences for those students' trajectories, how they're understood, how they're valued, what opportunities are given to them. And I think as a field of researchers, putting that front and foremost, that our work is always going to be applied somewhere, whether we were doing the applying or someone else, and being responsible for how we present it and mindful of what we're saying and not saying and the identities that we are ascribing to others, I think should be at the forefront of our work. And so I really deeply appreciate your work to put that out there, because I don't think that it always has been front and foremost in people's consciousness. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that, the labels that we use, they all have meanings. Those meanings shift constantly as well, and they have different meanings for different consumers of those labels. But the least we can do is engage with, explore and engage and pick up on how those labels are creating worlds and how they're damaging the people we think we want to support with our research, right? So it's a paradoxical situation, but to me it goes back in the end to this problem of not wanting to acknowledge that facts and values are together. They're inseparable. So research is not about basic and applied. Research is not just about objective facts. It cannot be. Once that wall is down, I can sit at the table with many of my colleagues, but so far it's just like the one thing that they will just not in any way back off from. So I don't know, I can create lots of metaphors, lots of ways of explaining things. I can go to the research on family bilingualism, infant bilingualism, from birth bilingualism, because all that research is quantitative, linguistic, and cognitive, but it's not deficit-oriented. Why? Because we all think that babies and infants are adorable. And whatever they do with language is fantastic, right? So we don't speak about a child like a 5-month-old, a 12-month-old, a 3-year-old not being able to do X or Y like a mature adult speaker as a problem. We don't, right? So reading that literature gives me a lot of ammunition to talk about findings and language that is possible when doing these kinds of research with adults. But then we go back to, okay, but our labels have effects. Our labels are performative. And then it's like, that's ideology, that's politics, or that's political correctness, even worse.
Dr. Ortega, oh, sorry, I just forgot how microphones amplify voices. Anyway, I couldn't help but notice in one of the slides that had Lesla learners and having to study Lesla learners. I think they're some of the most...
Which learners?
Lesla,
yes.
So one of the questions that I had is, because they're some of the most understudied and also challenging groups of people to study, and people have been, I guess, I feel like there's been what's the word? Motivation to study them, and however, in terms of the assessments, I'm wondering their appropriateness. So I guess my question is, in order to get to all the objectives that you had delineated, would, as a researcher, would assessment be one of the first things in order to be able to study these particular populations? Should an emphasis be placed on creating proper assessments to be able to study them?
So if it's, we can think about two things: research instruments to study them. So, for example, elicitation of literacy in their different languages to see what kind of literacy repertoires they already have or not have. And then we can think of assessment as official tests that assessment and language testing people create. So assessment, research instruments or tools for research that measure things. Okay, and assessment in the field of language testing. We do need both, in the sense that if I want my colleagues to apply their skills that are cognitive, linguistic, and quantitative to Lesla learners, then they're going to, at the moment they want and are willing to study Lesla learners, they are going to start developing instruments to study them. Now, if they still develop those instruments by norming them to monolingual native speakers or to highly educated native speakers, the instruments won't be good, right? So, yes, we need proper instruments, like you said, but first we need proper minds to understand what it is that we want to measure for a given context or a given profile of learner. So we do have more and more studies of Lesla, adult learners with limited formal education experiences and limited literacy in any language. We have more and more studies by SLA researchers of them, after the call by Martha Bigelow and Elaine Tarone to study them more. I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence that the researchers have been able to take that opportunity to actually transform their views of what language is, what language competencies are. And so I think they're looking at those participants with the lenses of any participant learning any language. And so we need to look at them for themselves. And they will give us then good instruments that will actually change how we view multilingualism as a whole. So we need those instruments, but they're not neutral and they're not going to be just like the instruments we have now for research.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Ortega. I just want to echo Dr. Pomerantz's comment and say I appreciated the reminder that researchers aren't excused for perpetuating the sorts of ideologies that people feel linguistically insecure about. And I'm worried about these colleagues of yours who you describe as not being convinced of this. And I wonder if you ever just want to skip them, right? Go straight to the home to school transition right? Is there another audience besides fellow SLA researchers who you think would be receptive to these sorts of ideas about the role of values in research?
I think there are many research communities that are receptive, but for me it's a problem. When research communities are mostly relying on qualitative methods, on context as the key variable that they're interested in studying, on post-structuralist views of world and knowledge, then they are absolutely willing and able to engage with values. When researchers have chosen and are trained in quantitative, statistical, psychometric, measurement types of research in the social sciences, like most second language acquisition researchers are, then they really just have no understanding of these things. So there are some solutions, I think, or small things we could do. For example, we could demand that SLA researchers, all of them, get a good training in critical sociolinguistics. So one of their many courses has to be that, just like they all think that SLA researchers without training in statistics is like a broken SLA researcher, incapable of doing good research, right? Well, how about if we start thinking that without a very good training in critical sociolinguistics, you cannot be a good SLA researcher, right? So for me, it's always been the case, I've always thought that the methods or the theories should not drive the kinds of ethics that a research community has, right? So, I mean, a very good example is the mismeasurement of man, right? The famous book by James Gould, right? Using quantitative data and logics that are absolutely positivistic to dismantle the myth that race determines intelligence, right? So the racist research was created with quantitative methods, biology, ways of thinking, positivistic ways of thinking, and it was contested and undone with the same methods. So for me, I don't buy that because I belong to a research community where the majority of theories and methods are quantitative, linguistic, and positivistic, that then we can't just learn to face values and ideologies and strategically incorporate them into our research so that we have the effects that we want to have with our research. I don't think any SLA researcher wants to oppress multilinguals or wants to perpetuate ideologies of language learning that are negative and harmful to the people who learn languages. But if we're doing it, we need to see it and we need to do something about it.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. The first time that I saw you present was at ISB 10, which was a very different context that had a very different audience and a very different reception to the ideas that you were presenting. And I thought that was interesting because you were presenting things at that conference and I was like, yeah, I was on board, and the rest of the audience was very skeptical about some of the things. You probably remember because it happens to you all the time.
Yeah, I don't particularly have any hurtful memory of that.
No, it was just people were skeptical.
I must have a very thick skin, I think.
and so the question that I have is, so I'm on board with your call for transforming how we're thinking about things in SLA, but part of what's implied in your argument seems to be that SLA is salvageable as a field, or at least has something for us to learn from. And I guess, could you speak a little bit more to that, what is it about quantitative, cognitive-oriented approaches to research that's still valuable for us to have as a field that we all can learn from if we kind of make these changes that you're proposing?
Yeah. I think numbers have a huge amount of power in the world. They have a lot of cachet with policymakers. And there are many fields that are quantitative and that devote themselves to more cognitive ways of looking at phenomena, right? So I don't think, just like we shouldn't exterminate monolinguals from this world, I think we shouldn't exterminate ways of doing research just because they're not the ways we want and like and value doing research. So I think SLA is not just salvageable, but SLA is a field that has, it yields a lot of power, precisely because of all these numbers and tests and assessments. And so then, if it's there and it's large and it has a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of many people, then it's even more important and there is a bigger responsibility for this, right? But let me give you a very concrete example of how quantitative research can be used for very many good things. Adam Winsler, how many of you know Adam Winsler, a researcher from George Mason University? He was at that colloquium. Okay, there we go. If 1.5 generation researchers don't speak to heritage language learner researchers, and the two funds of knowledge don't interact with each other, we're missing half of the story, right? So here, Adam Winsler is a psychologist using huge quantitative methods to study school children. So he has published in very key important journals several really large-scale studies, for example, of children in Miami. We're talking about 5,000 children in K through 12, not 12. He does always pre-kindergarten to 5th grade, right? So with irrefutable, impressive statistics, he's shown something that we all know, but that we can never convince anyone of who's a policymaker, many parents, and many teachers. He's shown that when immigrants at risk, so coming from very, very vulnerable socioeconomic backgrounds, when they report that at home they use Spanish, they are the ones who are most resilient and better off, and with the best English by 5th grade. So simple, we all know it, no one outside educational linguistics believes us. We've known, since this is like Jim Cummings come true, right? So his dream come true, because it's like with whole school districts, an amazing amount of tests and batteries, huge statistics that no one can refute. And what's the finding? That do make sure students at home use their home language with their parents, and that is a source of success for English and resilience in the face of the same challenges, the same risks, right? So that's a wonderful, but ideology really drives everything. So because the idea that the more you put resources and time into the first language, the better the second language is going to be, because that's completely contrary to the ideology of the hydraulic view of bilingualism, right? There's two languages that are competing. The more you do one, the less you can do the other. Yeah? It's a trade-off, right? That is ideologically common sense for most people in monolingually oriented, ideologically oriented societies, right? So you can't, even with these big studies, you can't convince and undo the ideology. So those studies have been published in the best peer-reviewed journals with the best statistics. They're showing something that is absolutely uncontestable. They're having zero effect. So I think any field is salvageable if they sit down with the values, if they produce knowledge that is useful, and if they are savvy enough to know that ideology is going to be the first roadblock to everything. And so how do we disseminate our findings regardless of our research, ways of doing research? How do we get this knowledge out there, right? But yeah, SLA is salvageable, of course. Sorry. Did you want? Yeah. I think you want. Yeah.
Continue. Okay. What I wanted to ask was, in my own observational understanding of what you're doing is you are proposing a social justice-oriented SLA.
Mm-hmm.
And in these uncertain times, as you said, where we have refugees from countries where we know, from the Middle East, for instance, or from Syria, how do we handle language learning or language teaching for these refugees, given the fact that they are already they are already experiencing high levels of social and linguistic duress?
Mm-hmm. That is what the field should be studying, right? That is what we should be studying. So, yeah, I mean, the problem is that language learning, of course, is a very small part of people's lives, but it can interact in huge ways with everything else, right? So in the case of refugees, I have colleagues who very well intentionally are studying things like creating language apps to give to refugees upon a settlement in the new country, and through the apps they're trying to learn the majority language. And for certain groups, the languages that they come with, you can put into the app so that it's easier for them to be using whatever, Arabic, and learning English through that. And the technology seems to help. But that's not enough. That's not enough because there are so many other pressing needs in the lives of refugees, right? So I would like to see teams of researchers who can work with refugee questions, both from all the other needs that are absolutely more urgent than language learning, but also the small piece of language learning. Right? But if SLA study after study only is done with college students, that's it. We're not producing, not only that, but we're also not producing knowledge about how the language mind has language, or how the human mind has language, because we're leaving out of the explanation. So it's like trying to create a theory of climatology out of the data we get from Hawaii. with a range of data that is super truncated, right? So we just study and study and study the temperatures, the storms, and the weather changes and seasons from study. And we create a whole theory of the world's climatology based on that, right? So this is the same. College students learning language under highly educated, highly literate, and highly privileged circumstances. And then, not only that, but then we claim that that's how the human mind works, right? So this is another argument. I didn't use it here, I don't think, but it's another argument that I try to use with my colleagues. They're so worried about validity, the validity of research. So I say, well, this is a huge threat to validity because you're studying something and generalizing it to all. You need to study all, or else you cannot talk about a theory of language learning.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. Always I enjoy listening to your talk. The class also, because I took your course like 10 years ago. So it's kind of, today's talk reminded me that time. I really agree with your idea that native speakers' model for the language learning or language learner is problematic. And then you actually suggest about like maybe successful language learners, or maybe even you said a mature language user, or maybe more focusing on the learner's experience. And then that construct is kind of complexified, and at the same time also make it difficult to define who is actually the mature language user and what kind of experience is it. And especially you do the quantitative research or even qualitative research, you have to define it. And then how do you kind of conceptualize this notion and the alternative as a monolingual or native speaker?
Right. Yeah, this I have looked at into quite a bit. So if we don't compare learners to native speakers, who do we compare them to? What is the benchmark then? What is the goal then? One thing that some SLA researchers have begun to do, and this is very good news, is to create a baseline to compare the learners of mature speakers, meaning in a particular study, I had it in the slide but I skipped it. In a particular study, for example, they were looking at what success with pronunciation in English would Japanese L1 learners reach after several years of studying in an English environment. So international students, what kind of success with pronunciation in English do they reach? The comparison was 10 Japanese L1 users of English who had arrived to the same city, Vancouver, at the age of 20 or older, had been living in Vancouver for at least 20 years, and reported using English very frequently for work and for home. So that they are the goal. It's like they've had a long life of using English, actually using it, not just being surrounded without having access to it. And they've had enough time to learn English. So their pronunciation is a mature L1 Japanese L2 English pronunciation. You can collect data from them, make them into your baseline, and compare it to the learners and see how much more the learners can and will go, right? Simple, right? I mean, it's simple to do that, right? Another comparison could be from birth bilinguals. So this is for colleagues who cannot let go of birthrights. Okay, you totally believe that being born into a language or languages gives you something special that is just different from everything else. Fine. So compare from birth, being born to 2 languages, and later in life, learning to function with those 2 languages. And then see what the timing difference does to these when the number of languages, although we're cutting up and counting languages, but when it's the language pair, in both cases is the same. So the child is not trying to learn 1 language only. The child is learning 2 languages simultaneously. But the adult is learning, well, 1 first and another second. What does the timing or the sequence does to it? But please keep constant the bilingualism. So there are solutions, and I cannot really understand why we're not empirically pursuing them a lot, because they really would give us different knowledge from what we already have. So many studies with native speakers as the baseline. We already know. The results are always, they're different. The monolingual native speakers are different from the bilingual late speakers. We know that, but there's nothing new to be found there.
Another possible approach would be longitudinal. Sorry. Another possible approach would be to have longitudinal study. In second language acquisition studies, and surprisingly, we don't have enough longitudinal studies. So that's also another way to go. So you don't have to compare one person with another person, per se, but you can actually, looking at one person's progression over time.
Yeah, we don't have many, but we have some. But again, we don't get out of that straitjacket if implicitly we're saying over 30 years, this person changed this much, but never got to being like a monolingual, right? Indistinguishable from a monolingual. I mean, that's so frequent in my field. Yes, they get really successful. They really are successful in using the new language eventually, but they will never be indistinguishable from a native speaker. By which all we mean, if you think about it, is they will never be monolingual-like. Well, yeah, because they're not, right? They have other languages in their lives and in them. Right? And again, I don't know how then we can make a leap towards it's not about how many languages one has.
In the case of studying, not second language acquisition, but studying idiolects.
Idiolects, yeah.
I think I'm simply saying that if you're worried about comparison, then it's the idiolects, these individuals that you are following. taking into account their idiosyncratic tendencies along because that will enable you to incorporate aspects about experience into that particular framework.
So idiolex is a solution. Actually, there is a theory within SLA that takes that approach, which is dynamic systems theory, and has begun to refuse to aggregate data into groups. So that can be, maybe that's another hope for the future, that more people will do it. Nancy, did you want to say something?
Here.
Okay, sorry.
Hi. Muchas gracias, Lourdes, por esta presentación. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So, as a historical linguist, a lot of what you're talking about, I can see how it's actually impacting my field, and it has for a real long time. You were talking about how people who are within second language acquisition don't always necessarily feel like going into questions of values and the influence of ideology and how would you research. And I mean, in historical linguistics, people are not even, it's not they're not willing to think about it, they haven't even heard about the question, right? So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how this type of multilingual turn that you're proposing could also be extended to fields beyond second language acquisition, to other areas of study of language like syntacticians or cognitive linguists. Is that too much of a stretch? Or?
No, I don't think it is. So cognitive linguists, for example, they have a very non-essentialist view of language, so that's a huge opening. They don't think that language can be separated from the context, the situation, the body. So they believe in body, world, language, continuities. So that in itself immediately opens up spaces for discussing other things. They have not engaged with, they have. There is some research on critical cognitive linguistics, looking at how metaphors and discourse construct worlds and entrench ideas and ways of interpreting and seeing the world that are oppressive, right? So that's, I think that, you can do anything you want with values as soon as you find them. As soon as you see them, like you can't turn your back, then that's it. There is no return. Then you can engage with them. So I think it's more like this step of making certain ways of doing research much, much more open to seeing that the values are always there from the beginning. For historical linguistics, I would say, how about a little bit of training in history? Not history of language, but also history, because history has gone through many phases, and by now they're hugely critical, and knowing that there is no single knowledge and no neutral knowledge. So maybe that's an opening.
Yes, on that last comment, I particularly appreciate the way you began your talk, giving us some longer vision in terms of time and place. But that wasn't the point of why I wanted to ask you. Or actually, I don't have a question. I just want to comment. I just can't resist commenting.
Absolutely.
Because I just want to thank you for an absolutely amazing talk. I have to say, it's the first time in a very long time that I've begun to feel some reason for, some way that SLA might be salvageable. I'm sorry to say that, but maybe I don't read widely enough or listen widely enough, and I love Diane Larson-Friedman. We have these great conversations. Yeah. But I'm often saying, but we've been saying this for so long. The social turn, the multilingual turn, I'm thinking, well, so what? Why are you all excited about this? So I just want to thank you, because you've really broken through that in a beautiful way, so clear, and you've obviously thought about it deeply. You've read widely. Every answer that you had, every concept that you presented.
How much energy and reading it takes to what do you call it? Like undo a given way of thinking, a given approach to the world, a training of many years. How much effort it takes? Like, all these ideas, I started thinking like, something's wrong, I just cannot continue doing this kind of research, right? Yeah. I think I started that in 2003 with the Spencer, with the Spencer postdoctoral fellowship, right? I said, oh, I just can't, right? So it's taken me from 2003, and every year, every talk, it's like a little bit more like, oh wait, I think this may have a future with my colleagues. It's like, I think this kind of argument really can, it leverages something that they understand, that they can connect to, right? And then reading from other fields, but not just qualitative readings, which I do a lot of, anthropological readings, sociological readings, educational readings, but also reading from quantitative stuff that is amazing, because I read it and I'm like, yeah, here, it's possible to do something about the brain and cognition and quantity and measurement and whatnot, and yet not to be using deficit ideas and deficit discourse, right? So if it's possible for other fields, it is possible for us, right? But, yeah. I mean, there are many openings, a lot of people from within the field, but the ethos and habitus of the field doesn't change much. So I agree, if I pick up an ESLA journal, mostly it's like, after a few words it's like, yeah. But once you see it, it can never be undone anymore. So I'm hoping, I reach a few colleagues at a time for some things of these things. But, once you read native-like and you think, oh, that means monolingual-like, it just drops the level of interpretability, value, common sense drops so low as you read the study, right? So if someone sees that, they can never just go back to something else that they were doing before.
So I don't want to cut off the conversation, I just want to move it slightly. So there are a couple of people who we haven't thanked sufficiently. So Charles Washington at the video camera, thank you, Charles. He has been to, I don't even know how many of these, 10, 11 in a row. He's never missed one. Also Suzanne, who's in the back, has been invaluable in coordinating. Sarah, who's here as well, and Catherine, who I think is holding down the fort back at GSE. So thank you to all of you for making this run smoothly. And of course, thank you again to Dr. Ortega for a magnificent talk and great discussion. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to clear this room so that they can set up the tables, and then we will come right back in and eat lunch together and continue these fabulous conversations. Thanks.